This is my true story. I spent my life building a home for my only son, a roof that was supposed to protect both of us in my final years. I gave him everything, my time, my savings, my trust. But one evening, that same son looked at me with cold eyes and shouted, "Get out or I'll call the police." The walls that once echoed laughter now held only silence. I didn't argue. I simply picked up the phone, and you won't believe who the police took away that night. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach others like me. He had spent most of his life building what he thought would be a legacy, not for himself, but for his only son. Every drop of sweat that fell from his forehead was an investment in a future he believed would carry his family's name with pride. He worked long days and longer nights, sometimes missing meals, sometimes skipping rest, but never once thinking of stopping. Every rupee he earned was carefully saved, not for comfort, not for luxury, but for the one person he loved more than himself. When his son was young, he'd carried him on his shoulders through the same land where he now stood alone. He remembered the laughter, the tiny hands grabbing at his shirt, the questions that never ended. He remembered saying, "This house will always be yours one day." Back then, it was a promise made with love. Years later, it would become the foundation of heartbreak. He built that house with his bare hands, brick by brick, month by month. The walls carried not just paint, but history. Each corner held memories, his wife's laughter before she passed, his son's school trophies, the smell of food that once filled their kitchen. That house wasn't just shelter. It was proof of his life's labor. When he handed the keys to his grown son years later, he did so with a heart full of pride. He thought, "Now my job is done." He helped his son open a business too, used his retirement savings as the seed money. The son promised he'd return it someday, but the father didn't care for repayment. All he wanted was to see his child succeed. He watched him grow confident, buy expensive clothes, host parties, and make connections. And while others saw an ambitious young man, the father saw something else growing quietly: entitlement. The son stopped thanking him, stopped listening, stopped visiting the old chair where they used to talk. Gratitude faded, replaced by ownership. The father told himself it was just the way of the new generation. Maybe kids were different now. Maybe they didn't express love the way he did. He convinced himself that as long as they were under one roof, the bond still lived. He was wrong. Over time, the son began changing the home, repainting rooms without asking, rearranging furniture, closing doors that were once open. He made decisions as if the place belonged solely to him. Even worse, he started talking about his house in front of neighbors, as though his father was just another resident. The father smiled politely, but inside, a quiet ache began to grow. He noticed the tone of his son's voice had changed too. It carried impatience, an invisible wall between them. Whenever he asked for small things, new medicine, a repair for the leaking tap, or even company during dinner, there was always an excuse. Later, "I'm busy. You don't understand how things work now." Those words piled up, turning affection into formality. Still, he endured it. Fathers do. They tell themselves, "He's young. He'll realize one day." But the realization never came. Instead, the distance grew wider. The son's wife joined in, slowly claiming space and control. She began locking the cupboards, labeling drawers, deciding what the old man could or couldn't use. He didn't argue. It was his son's home now, wasn't it? That's what he told himself, even though every legal paper still said otherwise. The father had spent a lifetime believing that respect naturally came to those who gave everything. He didn't understand that sometimes love, when given without limits, turns into something dangerous: expectation. His son no longer saw the man who had raised him. He only saw the old man who lived for free. Even then, the father stayed quiet. He still made tea for them in the mornings, still waited by the door for a word of affection, still cleaned the yard as he used to. He thought actions would remind them of love. But actions don't speak to those who have already stopped listening. He began to notice little signs: His things being moved, his name removed from the family documents on the wall, small comments from neighbors saying, "Your son is doing well with his house." Each time he heard that, he smiled weakly and nodded, but the truth sank deeper. The home he had built had started to reject him. He could have moved out, but where would he go? The house was his blood. Every corner, every nail, every tile was a part of him. He couldn't imagine leaving it behind. So he stayed, quietly, politely, believing time would soften his son's pride. But time didn't heal anything. It made everything worse. The more his son's business grew, the more arrogant he became. He forgot who had built the foundation for that success. He forgot the small, wrinkled hands that had held him steady when he stumbled. The father spent sleepless nights wondering where he went wrong. Was he too soft? Too trusting? Maybe he had given too much, made life too easy. Maybe the real mistake wasn't loving too little. It was loving too blindly. And still, every morning, he would whisper a small prayer for his son's happiness before he began his day. Even when the house no longer felt like home, he stayed kind. Even when respect was gone, he stayed hopeful. He thought, one day, my son will remember who I am. But that day never came. Instead, something darker did. The day his son shouted words that no parent should ever hear. Words that would end one chapter of his life and begin another. One not of defeat, but of quiet justice. It began slowly, like a chill that creeps in before winter fully arrives. At first, the son's voice lost its warmth, a small change, easy to dismiss. The words were the same, but the tone had turned sharp, hollow, mechanical. The father noticed it when simple requests, a cup of tea, a short walk, a question about the business, were met with irritation instead of care. The love that once flowed so naturally now felt rationed, like every word cost something. He tried not to take it personally. After all, sons grow up, priorities shift, life gets busy. That's what he told himself, even as his heart began to tighten with quiet unease. The son had become a man of the city now, ambitious, loud, and quick to dismiss the slower rhythm of his father's world. He dressed in tailored suits, spoke with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and moved as if the world owed him its attention. The father watched with mixed pride and worry. Pride, because his son had achieved everything he had once dreamed of. Worry, because the man standing before him no longer resembled the boy he had raised. His son's wife didn't help. She had charm and beauty, but also a way of planting words like seeds that grew into walls. The father could feel her subtle distance, polite on the surface, but cold underneath. Whenever he entered the room, her conversation with his son would fall silent. Whenever he spoke, her smile was forced. And slowly, her whispers began to shape how his son saw him. "She's right," the father would hear his son say. "He's old-fashioned. He doesn't understand how things work now." Those words were not meant for him, but he heard them anyway, through the thin walls of the house he built. He pretended he hadn't, pretended that respect was still there. But something invisible was shifting. The son, once patient and affectionate, began acting like the father's presence was a burden. There were small signs, moments that, alone, would mean nothing, but together told a painful truth. The father noticed that his seat at the dinner table was moved further away. His suggestions about finances were brushed off. His name was removed from documents that once bore it proudly. Even his old photographs, the ones hanging in the living room, were quietly replaced by new frames, smiling faces of the younger couple, as if the past didn't exist anymore. He tried to talk less, to stay out of their way. But no matter how much space he gave, the son still found reasons to be irritated. When the father asked a question, it was too much interference. When he stayed silent, it was too cold. Every gesture, whether small or kind, seemed to annoy them. The son's friends began to visit often, filling the house with laughter, music, and arrogance. The father would sit quietly in his room, listening to the sounds of a life that had moved on without him. Sometimes, he would peek out and see them sitting where he used to sit, laughing about things he couldn't understand. He wasn't angry, just invisible. But the change became clearer during one evening gathering. The father stepped out to greet the guests, only to hear his son say, "Don't mind the old man, he just hangs around." Laughter followed. It wasn't cruel in tone, but it was enough. It broke something deep inside him. He smiled weakly and went back to his room, closing the door slowly so no one would hear how heavy his heart had become. He didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that something had died long before its time. Respect. He had given his son everything, yet somewhere along the way, the boy had learned that love was a one-way street. The more he gave, the less he was valued. Days turned into weeks. The son's temper grew shorter, his patience thinner. He began snapping over small things, misplaced keys, forgotten phone calls, even the noise of the father's footsteps. The father tried to make himself smaller, quieter. He began eating alone, folding his own laundry, staying out of sight. But it didn't matter. To his son, even his silence was an inconvenience. The whispers from his daughter-in-law continued. "He's too stubborn. He doesn't appreciate what we do. Maybe he should move somewhere smaller." Each word chipped away at the bond between father and son until it was just a thread stretched to its limit. The father still hoped that one day his son would wake up, remember the sacrifices, the love, the countless nights he'd spent working to pay for his education, his business, his future. But that day never came. Instead, what came next was colder than he could have ever imagined. It began with small acts of disrespect turning into open defiance. The son stopped calling him father. He became old man, him, or sometimes nothing at all. His voice carried no warmth, only command. He made household decisions without consulting him, controlled finances without permission, and even began referring to the house as mine in conversations with outsiders. One afternoon, the father overheard his son telling a friend, "I can't wait to get him out. He doesn't even need this big place anymore." Those words cut deeper than any knife could. It wasn't just about the house. It was about erasure. His existence had become an obstacle. Still, the father stayed quiet. He had learned that arguments only fed disrespect. Instead, he turned inward. He prayed, he wrote, he thought. And while his son grew louder, the father grew calmer. Like a storm preparing to end itself in silence. He began noticing how often his son's wife handled the finances, how she moved papers around when he entered the room. Once, he caught a glimpse of property documents spread across the table, his property, and his son quickly covered them up. That was the day he realized they were not just cold. They were planning something. The father didn't confront them. He simply began to take note of everything, where documents were kept, who handled what, how bills were paid, which accounts were linked. The lessons of a lifetime of hard work were still with him, and while his body had grown old, his mind was sharp. In public, the son continued his act, the dutiful man caring for his difficult father. But behind closed doors, cruelty began to replace care. Voices were raised more often. Disrespect turned into dismissal. There were nights when the father would eat cold food left on the counter because they'd forgotten or chosen not to invite him to the table. Yet he never complained. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Every insult, every ignored word, every moment of loneliness became another piece of quiet strength. He waited. Because old age teaches you one thing better than anything else. Time reveals everything. And so he endured, until the day came when the mask completely fell away. It was a day like any other, ordinary in its beginning, but unforgettable in its end. The son, pushed by arrogance and false pride, would finally cross a line that could never be uncrossed. But when that day came, the father wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't argue, or fight, or beg. He would simply watch, let the son bury himself in his own cruelty, and then, with quiet precision, turn the tables completely. Because respect, once broken, cannot be rebuilt with words. Only actions can speak for the truth that arrogance tries to silence. And his son, though he didn't know it yet, was about to learn that the man he thought was weak still held the power to decide who truly belonged in that house. Morning arrived with quiet clarity. The world outside was calm, but inside the father's heart, something had shifted forever. The humiliation, the shouting, the threat. It no longer burned like fire. It sat deep inside him, cold and resolved. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger fades. But resolve, that becomes steel. And that morning, he decided it was time to act with that steel. The sun was just rising, spreading gold across the window pane. He sat at his small table with a cup of tea cooling beside him, the same routine he had followed for decades. But this time, there was no routine in his thoughts. He was replaying the night before, every word, every sneer, every moment where his son had looked at him not as a father, but as an inconvenience. He could still hear it. "Get out, or I'll call the police." He smiled faintly. That one sentence had done something remarkable. It had set him free. For years, he had tolerated disrespect because of love. Now, that same love had been buried under arrogance, and what replaced it was clarity. He had spent his life protecting his son. Now, he would protect himself, calmly, lawfully, and without guilt. He looked at the papers spread before him. Property deeds, ownership certificates, bank records. Every proof that this home, the walls, the roof, the ground beneath their feet, belonged to him, not them. Not the son who shouted, not the wife who whispered poison. Him, the man who had built everything from nothing. He picked up the telephone receiver, its cord slightly twisted, and began dialing the number of the local police station. His fingers were steady, his voice calm. Years of discipline had trained him to never shout when he was certain of truth. When the officer answered, he spoke clearly. He didn't cry or sound weak. He introduced himself, gave his address, and explained what had happened. He told them about the shouting, the threat, the attempt to force him out of his own house. He told them that the property was in his name, that he feared escalation. He didn't dramatize. He simply presented facts, every word careful, deliberate. The officer on the line listened attentively. When the old man offered to show the legal documents, the tone changed from skepticism to respect. They promised to send someone over to check on the situation. When he put down the phone, he sat in silence for a while. There was no joy in it, just a steady feeling of control returning. The feeling of a man who had been ignored but not erased. He went to his room and dressed neatly, ironed shirt, clean trousers, shoes polished. The kind of dignity that comes from habit, not pride. He wanted to face the world looking like the man he still was, composed, not broken. As he buttoned his shirt, he glanced at his reflection in the mirror. The face that looked back at him was wrinkled and lined with years of work and worry, but behind those lines was strength. A quiet kind of strength that never needed to shout to be heard. By the time the police car arrived, the sun was high. 2 officers stepped out, one young, one older. They greeted him politely. He invited them inside, offering them chairs, even water. Old habits of hospitality never die. They asked questions, calm, procedural questions. He answered each one clearly. Then came the moment that would change everything. The sun appeared, bleary-eyed and irritated, just waking up. When he saw the officers, his face twisted in disbelief. He demanded to know what was going on, his voice rising in the same arrogant tone that had become familiar. The officer held up a hand and asked him to sit. The father quietly stood up and handed over a folder, the property papers, neatly organized. His name was there in bold, unmistakable letters. Ownership, registration, everything. The officer nodded and asked the son if he had any proof that the house was his. He didn't. His mouth opened and closed, like a man trying to argue with gravity. When the officer asked him to calm down, the son snapped again, shouting, pointing fingers, blaming his father for embarrassment. But the louder he grew, the smaller he became in the eyes of those watching. The officers remained calm, professional. They asked him to step outside. He refused. They warned him once more, but arrogance makes a man deaf. Within minutes, the situation shifted. Handcuffs, words of authority, the creak of a door closing as they led him away. The old man stood still. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just exhaled softly. For years he had been silenced by guilt, the guilt of being an aging father, dependent on the very person he raised. But in that one moment, all the weight lifted. He realized something profound. He was not powerless. Age had taken his youth, not his rights. As the car drove away, the neighbors gathered, whispering. They had heard shouting the night before, but none of them knew the truth. Now, they watched in stunned silence. One of them, an old friend, stepped closer and asked softly, "You okay?" The father nodded. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." Inside, the house felt different. The same walls, the same furniture, but the energy had changed. For years, he had walked through those rooms feeling small. That day, for the first time, he walked with quiet ownership. He wasn't proud of what happened, but he wasn't sorry either. Sometimes peace comes only after a storm. He sat back down in his chair, staring out at the sunlight spilling through the curtains. The sound of the clock ticking in the corner was steady, reassuring. Every second felt earned. Every breath, his own. He thought of the years he had spent making excuses for cruelty. "He's young," he used to say. "He's stressed. He'll come around." But none of that had been true. Cruelty wasn't youth. It was choice. And he had chosen differently, to meet cruelty with calm, to meet threats with truth. He hadn't called the police for revenge. He had called them for justice, for the dignity that no man, not even a son, has the right to steal from his father. Later that afternoon, as he brewed another cup of tea, he thought of the irony. His son had threatened to call the police to throw him out. Yet when the police came, they had taken the son instead. It wasn't poetic justice. It was simply balance. Life has a way of correcting itself when truth stands firm. That night, the house was quiet again. No shouting, no tension, no footsteps of anger, just stillness. The father sat by the window as the moon rose over the rooftops. The cool air touched his face, and he felt lighter. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even think about what would come next. He just let peace settle where pain used to live. For once, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of closure, full of meaning, full of the realization that sometimes the smallest actions can reclaim the biggest losses. He had made a call, one simple, calm, deliberate act, and that act had rewritten his story. He took one last look at the sky before closing his eyes to rest. The stars looked clearer that night, sharper, maybe because the weight he'd carried for so long was finally gone. He whispered softly to himself before sleep came, the words a quiet truth he had earned. "He told me to get out, or he'd call the police. So I did, and they took him instead." The next morning began with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe, but waits. The air in the house was heavy, thick with the echoes of what had happened the day before. The father sat at the edge of his bed, the soft light of dawn falling across his face, tracing every line of exhaustion and age. He wasn't thinking about victory. He wasn't thinking about his son sitting in a cell overnight. He was thinking about truth, how heavy it becomes when it's been ignored for too long, and how light it feels once it's finally spoken aloud. When the knock came at the door, it wasn't loud. It was respectful. The officers had returned, not for conflict, but for clarity. The older one greeted him with a small nod, holding a file under his arm. "We just need to finalize the statements," he said gently. The father invited them in and served them tea, because even in the aftermath of betrayal, kindness was still his habit. As they spoke, the truth unfolded piece by piece, like a long-forgotten story being rewritten correctly for the first time. The officers confirmed that the son had resisted arrest, shouting until the very end that the house was his. They had searched the public records. The property deed was clear. The father was the sole owner. The law, at last, had spoken in the voice of reason. One of the officers, younger and visibly uncomfortable, asked, "Do you want to press additional charges?" The old man shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "The truth is enough." He didn't need punishment. He needed peace. And peace, he realized, often begins when you stop trying to prove your worth to those who've already decided to ignore it. The officers left after a few hours, leaving behind not just official papers, but a sense of finality. The father walked through the house again, slower this time. Every step echoed differently now, not with pain, but with ownership. He had reclaimed what was his, not just the walls and floor, but his dignity. For the first time in years, he could breathe without feeling small. By noon, word had spread through the neighborhood. People whispered, as people always do. Some pitied the son, others pitied the father. But the old man didn't care for pity anymore. He didn't care for anyone's opinion. He had lived long enough to understand that public judgment fades faster than private peace. Later that afternoon, the son returned home. The sound of his footsteps was hesitant, not heavy with arrogance this time, but with the quiet weight of defeat. The door creaked open, and there he stood, eyes bloodshot, face pale, pride shattered. He looked at his father, who sat calmly in the living room, sipping tea as if waiting for this moment. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The silence between them carried everything: years of sacrifice, moments of betrayal, and now the final understanding of what it means to cross the line between love and disrespect. The son's gaze fell to the papers lying on the table, the property deed, the arrest report, the signed acknowledgement from the police. The truth stared back at him, undeniable. His arrogance had met its limit, not because of confrontation, but because of evidence. He mumbled something under his breath, perhaps an apology, perhaps an excuse. The father didn't respond. He simply gestured toward the door, not with anger, but with quiet authority. For once, the son obeyed without question. He left the house he once claimed as his kingdom, reduced to a man learning humility the hard way. As the door closed behind him, the old man felt no triumph, only stillness. He wasn't proud of what had happened. No father ever is when he's forced to teach his child a lesson through pain. But he was grateful for the truth. Truth, he realized, is like sunlight. It doesn't need permission to enter a room. It simply does, and everything it touches can never go back to shadow. He sat there for a long time, his tea growing cold beside him. His mind wandered back to the early years, when his son was small, when laughter filled the same house that now echoed with memory. He remembered teaching him how to tie his shoes, how to ride a bicycle, how to speak respectfully to others. Somewhere along the way, that respect had been lost, drowned in success, ego, and pride. But now, stripped of everything, the illusion of ownership, the shield of arrogance, his son had faced what he'd been running from, the truth of his own reflection. In the evening, a neighbor stopped by. She was kind, a widow from 2 houses down. She had brought a small box of sweets. "You did what had to be done," she said softly. The old man smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for revenge," he replied. "I did it to stop pretending." That night, he sat in his chair again, the same spot by the window. The moonlight poured in gently, washing over the old furniture and the photographs on the wall. Everything looked the same, yet everything was different. He realized that truth doesn't destroy. It purifies. It removes everything false, everything unnecessary, until only what matters remains. His son had built walls of lies, thinking they would protect him. But truth had walked straight through them, silent and unstoppable. He picked up a pen and began writing in his small notebook again. His handwriting was slow but steady. He wrote, "Truth is quiet. It doesn't need to shout. It only waits, and when it speaks, every lie must kneel." He closed the notebook and placed it beside his bed. As he lay down, he felt the weight of years lifting off him. He had carried guilt for too long. Guilt for being old, for needing help, for still existing in a world that values youth over wisdom. But now, he realized he owed no one an apology for surviving. When sleep finally came, it was deep, peaceful, and dreamless. The kind of sleep that comes only after decades of turmoil finally find their end. The next morning, he woke to sunlight on his face. Birds chirped outside the window. The house was quiet, but not lonely anymore. He made his tea, watered the small plants by the window, and looked out at the street below. Life was continuing, as it always does, but for him, something had truly changed. He no longer needed his son's approval, nor anyone's company to feel whole. He had the one thing that money, power, and family could not buy: self-respect. And as he stood there, watching the sunlight stretch across his floor, he whispered to himself, "Yesterday they doubted me. Today they know who I am. I didn't shout. I didn't fight. I just showed them the truth." He smiled, not the smile of victory, but of freedom. Because the truth, once revealed, doesn't just set you free. It restores everything you thought you had lost: dignity, peace, and the quiet certainty that you were right all along. The shift began slowly, not with sound, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows when truth has settled into every corner of a house. The father woke early that morning, long before sunrise. He sat by the window as the first light crept through the curtains, watching dust float in the golden glow. For the first time in years, that light felt warm, not harsh. It didn't remind him of labor or loss. It reminded him of peace. He brewed his tea with calm, steady hands. The same kettle, the same routine. But everything felt new. The night before, he had finally seen the law take his side. The son who once shouted, "Get out or I'll call the police," was now the one silenced by authority. That twist of fate wasn't revenge, it was balance, a simple correction written by truth itself. He knew his son would return eventually. Pride can't stay quiet for long. And sure enough, by mid-morning, he heard the sound of a car engine outside. He didn't move immediately. He just sat there, sipping tea, waiting. When the door opened, his son's voice came through. No longer loud, no longer commanding. It carried something else now: fear. The father didn't turn to look at him. He didn't need to. He could feel the guilt hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. The son stood there, trying to find words that would fit the moment, but there were none. Pride had built walls that apologies couldn't break. Finally, the son muttered something about misunderstanding, about losing his temper, about being sorry. The words were soft, uncertain, shaped more by regret than sincerity. The father listened quietly, still staring out the window. He wasn't angry anymore. He had gone beyond anger, into a place where emotion no longer ruled him. After a long pause, he spoke just one sentence: "This house belongs to peace now." His voice was calm, measured, and final. The son lowered his eyes, realizing what that meant. He wasn't being yelled at, but dismissed, a far deeper punishment. The old man stood and walked toward his study. On the desk were stacks of documents, bank accounts, property deeds, legal notices, all neatly arranged. He had already made his decision. He would not throw his son out with violence or vengeance. He would do what life had taught him best: end things quietly, completely, and on his own terms. He picked up a single envelope, the revised property transfer document. It was signed, notarized, and ready. Inside, he had transferred full ownership of the house into his own trust, one that would be sealed until his passing. No one, not even his son, could touch it now. He placed the envelope on the table and turned to face the boy who once carried his dreams. "This," he said simply, "is the last thing you'll see with my name beside yours." The son froze, unable to reply. He reached out instinctively, but his father stepped back. There was no rage in his eyes, only clarity, the kind of calm that comes from a lifetime of learning that silence hurts more than shouting. "You called the police," the father continued. "You wanted me gone. So I went. From your world, not this house." The words landed with precision, sharp but measured. The son's face twisted, first with confusion, then with shame. He had thought that control came from dominance. But now he saw that real power comes from stillness, from a man who no longer needs to prove anything. The father sat back down, picked up his cup, and took another slow sip of tea. "Leave," he said softly. "You'll find peace outside. I already have mine here." And the son did. He walked out quietly, without slamming the door this time. The street outside was bright, the world alive with movement, but for him, everything felt smaller. Every step away from that house felt like walking away from the life he'd taken for granted. The father watched from the window, not as punishment, but as closure. He didn't smile, he didn't sigh. He just watched, calm and still. There was no satisfaction in his heart, only release, the gentle relief of a wound finally healed. Days turned into weeks. The neighborhood settled into its rhythm again. The whispers faded. People stopped asking questions. The old man's routine returned to quiet simplicity. Tending the garden, reading old books, walking to the corner shop in the evenings. The house became peaceful once more, a place of still air and gentle mornings. But for the son, the silence became a storm. With his father no longer answering calls, no longer present to support him financially, his life began to unravel. The arrogance that had built his image among friends began to crack. Debts piled up. The car, once a symbol of pride, sat idle, gathering dust. The very people he had tried to impress started avoiding him. He began visiting the house at odd hours, knocking on the gate, sometimes pleading, sometimes shouting, but the father never opened the door. He had made his choice, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect. There comes a time when a man must protect his peace, even from his own blood. One evening, a letter arrived. It was from the bank, a notification that the father's accounts had been fully secured, the ownership of all assets transferred solely to his trust. It was official now. The son no longer had any claim, any access, any control. The empire he once believed was his had vanished overnight, not through anger, but through law. The father placed the letter on the table, folded his glasses, and whispered to himself, "Everything ends the way it should." That night he wrote another note in his journal. "Revenge is loud. Justice is quiet. I chose quiet." He looked around the room. The same clock ticked softly on the wall. The same lamp glowed in the corner. But the energy inside that house had changed forever. No more fear, no more humiliation, only calm, earned through patience and wisdom. As he prepared for bed, the father reflected on the irony of it all. His son had once believed that power came from control, from shouting, from authority, from threats. But real power, he now knew, came from knowledge. The kind of knowledge that allows a man to hold his peace while the world around him trembles. And when he lay down that night, sleep came easily, the deep, untroubled kind that only visits those who have made peace with truth. Because in the end, he hadn't just turned the situation around, he had turned his life around. He had walked through fire without screaming, he had been insulted without breaking, and now he stood free, untouchable, unshaken, and unbothered. That was the real turnaround. Not the son's arrest, not the legal victory, but the quiet triumph of a father who had reclaimed himself. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet for the son, and perfectly quiet for the father. The old man no longer checked his phone, no longer waited for messages or knocks at the door. The silence that once felt heavy had now become his comfort. He finally understood that peace isn't the absence of noise, it's the absence of chaos. For the son, however, silence became punishment. The first few days after the confrontation, he moved through life in disbelief. His pride had always protected him from guilt, but now that pride had nothing to cling to. His friends, the ones who used to admire his confidence and wealth, had already heard the story. News travels fast in small neighborhoods. Everyone knew what happened: the shouting, the arrest, the humiliation of being proven wrong inside his own father's house. He tried to explain it away, blaming the situation, twisting the story to make himself look like the victim. But people aren't fools. They could see the truth, and worse, they could feel it. The arrogance he once carried now looked like insecurity. The man who had mocked his father in front of others now avoided eye contact in public. Respect, once lost, rarely returns. Meanwhile, the father's life moved on quietly. He began each morning with tea and a walk outside. The air felt cleaner somehow, the sky brighter. Every sunrise reminded him that he had survived something deeper than betrayal. He had survived forgetting himself. He no longer thought of revenge or justice. He thought of balance, the balance of love and pride, silence and truth. But the son couldn't find that balance. His world began to unravel piece by piece. First came the financial strain. The accounts he used freely were now frozen under the father's trust. The credit cards that carried his name but were linked to his father's resources stopped working. Bills piled up. The apartment he rented to impress his friends became a burden he could no longer afford. He called the father repeatedly, but the calls went unanswered. He sent messages, long ones, short ones, even angry ones. None were read. The old man had decided that peace was worth more than communication. He had already said everything that needed saying. The son's friends stopped visiting. His wife, embarrassed by the story spreading through whispers and laughter, began distancing herself too. She blamed him for losing everything, the comfort, the reputation, the stability. Soon, arguments filled their home. And just like that, the cycle of cruelty continued. Only now, he was the one at the receiving end. The father, on the other hand, had found something unexpected: forgiveness, not for his son, but for himself. He forgave himself for the years he stayed silent, for the times he excused bad behavior in the name of love. He forgave himself for allowing disrespect to go unchallenged, because now he understood. Love without boundaries is not kindness, it's surrender. And he had stopped surrendering the day he made that call. Weeks turned into months. The father received letters from banks confirming full control over his assets. He met with his lawyer one last time, signed the remaining documents, and smiled as he left the office. The lawyer, who had handled many bitter family cases, looked at him with quiet admiration. "You did it the right way," he said. The old man nodded. "There's only one right way," he replied, "the lawful way." Meanwhile, the son's reputation fell apart completely. The same neighbors who once envied him now pitied him. No one trusted him with money or responsibility. Even at work, whispers followed him. "The man who tried to throw his father out of his own house." Those words stuck like a stain he couldn't wash away. One evening, he drove to his father's home, parked across the street, and just sat there. The lights were on inside, soft and warm. He saw the shadow of the old man moving around the living room, slow but steady. It struck him then, his father didn't look lonely. He looked free. That realization cut deeper than the humiliation of being arrested. Because for the first time, the son saw what real strength looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It didn't need an audience. It was quiet and unshakable, like the roots of an old tree that had weathered every storm. He sat there for hours, watching through the windshield, waiting for some sign, a glance, a wave, anything. But his father never looked out. He didn't need to. The chapter had closed. The son had become what he once accused his father of being: invisible. Inside the house, the father knew his son was there. He had felt it, that strange awareness only parents have. But he didn't move. He stayed still, sipping tea by the window, watching the clock tick forward. He knew that every second that passed was teaching his son the one lesson he had refused to learn. Actions have echoes. Eventually, the car drove away, its headlights fading into the night. The father exhaled slowly, not from relief, but from finality. He had spent years trying to keep his family together. Now he understood that sometimes you have to let things fall apart for truth to stand. That night, he walked out to the small garden behind the house. The air was cool, the sky wide and open. He looked up at the stars and smiled faintly. "Peace," he whispered. Finally. The next morning, he began planning something new, something for himself. He called a travel agency, booked a one-way ticket to a quiet coastal town, and arranged to sell the house through his lawyer. He didn't need it anymore. It had served its purpose: a lesson, a witness, and now a memory. When he left, he carried little with him. Just a few clothes, his documents, and an old photograph of his wife and son from happier days. He didn't hate his son, he simply released him. because holding on to pain, he realized, is just another way of staying locked in the past. In his new town, he lived simply. A small apartment overlooking the sea, mornings filled with the sound of waves, evenings with the golden sun sinking into the horizon. The people there didn't know his story. They saw him as what he truly was, a quiet old man who smiled easily and spoke softly. Sometimes, while walking along the beach, he would see fathers and sons together, laughing, arguing, sharing life. A pang of memory would touch him, but it passed quickly. He had made peace with what was gone. He had given his son everything: love, time, forgiveness. And when that wasn't enough, he had given him the hardest gift of all: consequence. Back in the city, the son slowly began to rebuild, but the mark of what happened never faded. He would sometimes see his father's name in official papers or trust records and feel the sting of regret. He understood now that respect isn't inherited, it's earned, and once lost, it's rarely recovered. The father never returned. He never wrote, never called, never explained. But in his silence lived a powerful message, one his son would carry for the rest of his life. Love without respect cannot survive, and respect without humility cannot last. And so, the story ended not with noise, but with stillness. The father found peace. The son found consequence. Both found truth, though in very different ways. The sea became his new companion. Every morning, as dawn painted the sky in shades of silver and gold, the old man would walk along the shore, feeling the sand give way beneath his feet. The rhythm of the waves felt like a heartbeat, steady, patient, forgiving. It was the opposite of everything he had lived through. No shouting, no tension, no noise, just calm and repetition, the kind of peace that only nature knows how to offer. His cottage was small, 2 rooms, whitewashed walls, and a little balcony that looked out toward the horizon. The furniture was simple, built from wood polished by years of use. There was a chair by the window, a table for tea, and a shelf lined with books that smelled faintly of salt. It was a modest space, but it was entirely his. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have to ask permission for anything. He lived without rush. Morning tea brewed slowly. Meals were cooked with intention. Evenings passed with the soft hum of an old radio and the gentle whisper of wind through open windows. The world had stopped demanding from him. After years of carrying everyone else's weight, he could finally carry only himself. He often visited the local market, where fishermen sold their catch and women sold baskets of fruit. The townspeople knew him as the quiet gentleman by the sea. They didn't know his story. They only saw a kind old man with steady eyes and calm manners. And he liked it that way. It felt good to be known for peace instead of pain. He befriended a few locals, a retired teacher who played chess at the pier, a widow who baked bread and insisted he take a loaf every Sunday, and a boy who helped him carry groceries and listened to his small lessons about patience and kindness. They filled his days with conversation and small acts of care, never asking too much, never giving too little. It was the balance he had always wanted. In the afternoons, he often sat on the balcony, watching the ocean stretch endlessly before him. The waves reminded him of life, unpredictable, but always moving forward. Sometimes he thought about his son, wondering if time had softened his arrogance, if the silence had taught him something. But he never reached for the phone. Forgiveness, he had learned, doesn't always require reconciliation. Sometimes it's enough to forgive quietly and move on. He began keeping a journal again, writing not about pain or loss, but about gratitude. I eat when I want. I sleep when I wish. I wake to the sound of peace. Each entry was a reflection of how far he had come, from shouting walls to silent waves, from humiliation to harmony. He took care of himself now. The same man who once depended on others for medicine and comfort had learned independence in the most complete way. He cooked, cleaned, and walked daily. The salt air seemed to strengthen him, and the sun gave him warmth that no home full of people had ever given. Once a month, he would visit the local temple, not out of ritual, but to sit in the quiet, surrounded by flickering lamps and the scent of incense. He didn't pray for change anymore. He prayed for balance, for his heart to remain steady, for his peace to remain undisturbed. He became something of a mystery to the villagers, a man who smiled without reason, who listened more than he spoke, and whose calm seemed contagious. They didn't know that behind his stillness was a lifetime of storms. They didn't see the weight of lessons he carried in silence. Sometimes children would ask him for stories, and he'd tell them gentle ones, about seasons, rivers, and kindness. He never spoke about betrayal or revenge. Those were lessons for grown hearts, not innocent ones. But in every story he told, there was a hidden truth, that goodness is not weakness, and silence is not surrender. Years passed this way, slowly, beautifully. Each year felt like a chapter he was finally writing for himself. The cottage aged with him. Its paint chipped a little, its walls gathered the scent of time. But it stood firm, like him, not untouched by life, but undefeated by it. Every evening, as the sky turned orange and the waves shimmered like melted gold, he'd sit with his tea, close his eyes, and listen. The sea never stopped moving, but it never rushed. It just existed, powerful and calm, exactly how he wanted to live. He sometimes imagined his son walking along another coast somewhere, maybe older, maybe wiser, maybe realizing what he had lost, maybe learning that love without respect is a fragile thing, too easy to break and too hard to rebuild. But the father never wished him harm. He wished him understanding. Because even in betrayal, a father's heart never turns entirely cold. It simply learns where not to stand anymore. As his hair turned whiter and his steps slower, he found himself speaking less and smiling more. When neighbors asked about his past, he'd just say, "I lived a long story and found my ending by the sea." And that was the truth. He didn't seek revenge or recognition. He didn't crave apologies. He had chosen the simplest form of freedom, peace earned through letting go. When storms rolled across the ocean, shaking the windows and roaring against the rocks, he never felt fear. He'd sit by the fire, sipping his tea, knowing that every storm ends eventually, just like the one he'd survived. He lived like that for years, quietly, gracefully, fully. Until one morning, the villagers noticed smoke not rising from his chimney. They found him in his chair, still and peaceful, the ocean light spilling across his face. A half-empty cup of tea sat beside him. On the table lay his final journal entry. It read, "Peace is not given. It is earned by surviving what should have broken you." And below that, one last line. "If anyone remembers me, remember this. I left quietly, the same way truth enters a room." That was how his story ended, not with anger or noise, but with calm. The man who had once been shouted at, betrayed, and humiliated had found his own eternity in the one place where no one could ever take it from him, within himself. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the sharpest memories. Years passed by the sea, and the old man's heart grew lighter, not because he forgot, but because he understood. The bitterness that once lived inside him had dissolved, replaced by quiet wisdom. Life, he realized, isn't about avoiding pain. It's about surviving it and still choosing gentleness afterward. He often sat by the window during sunrise, hands wrapped around his cup of tea, watching the light spread across the water. The sea never asked questions. It simply existed, like truth. It reminded him of something important, that peace is not a gift someone gives you. Peace is something you claim when the world stops being kind. Looking back, he didn't see his story as one of revenge. Revenge burns hot, but it fades. What he did was colder, calmer, and far more lasting. He had chosen dignity over anger. That was the difference between losing everything and losing himself. He thought of his son sometimes, not with hatred, but with distance. The memory of the slap, the shouting, the humiliation. It no longer hurt. It felt like a story from another life, something that had happened to another man. The pain had taught him patience, and the betrayal had taught him strength. He no longer asked why it happened. He only thanked fate that he had lived long enough to understand it. The greatest lesson, he often thought, was this: forgiveness and trust are not the same. Forgiveness frees you. Trust, once broken, doesn't always return. He forgave his son long ago, but he never let him back into his peace. Some doors, once closed, must stay that way. Not out of hate, but out of self-respect. He remembered the day his son called the police, the look of arrogance on his face, the loudness of his voice. Now, thinking of it, he only smiled softly. It wasn't anger anymore. It was pity. The son had believed that power came from control, but real power comes from composure. The father had learned that standing still while others rage is the greatest strength a man can show. Sometimes, when the villagers came to visit, they'd sit and listen to him speak. He never told them names or details. He just shared what he had learned. That respect is not inherited, it's earned. That love without gratitude becomes poison. That silence can heal wounds words never could. He told them that the world has a strange sense of balance. The ones who humiliate others eventually live with their own emptiness. The ones who stay silent, who take the hit and keep walking, often find peace waiting at the end of their road. Don't chase revenge, he'd say gently. Let it chase itself. At night, he wrote reflections in his journal, not long paragraphs, just small truths shaped like whispers to himself. People show you their love through patience. They show you their character through how they handle your weakness. Sometimes losing your family's approval is how you gain your own peace. Walking away doesn't mean defeat. It means you finally stopped fighting battles beneath you. Every sentence felt like a closing door, soft, firm, necessary. He had seen what anger could do to men. It made them loud, bitter, and blind. But calmness? Calmness could destroy arrogance without raising a voice. It could rebuild a man from ashes. That's what he had become, rebuilt. His health had weakened with age, but his spirit never did. Each morning, he walked slowly along the beach, leaning on his cane, nodding at children who waved. The fishermen would greet him as Baba, a term of warmth and respect. It made him smile. Once upon a time, his own son couldn't say that word with kindness. Now, strangers used it with love. He had built something better than wealth or legacy. He had built peace. And peace, he often thought, was the only inheritance worth leaving behind. One evening, as the sun began to set, he sat on the balcony and thought of all he had lost. The house, the family dinners, the laughter, the noise. Then he realized something profound. Not all loss is tragedy. Sometimes loss is the price of truth. Sometimes it's the beginning of freedom. He whispered to himself, maybe we don't lose people. Maybe we just outgrow the pain they gave us. And he believed it. His story wasn't meant to make people sad. It was meant to remind them that even in betrayal, dignity can survive. That you can be wronged and still walk away clean. That you can be broken and still rebuild with grace. He never hated his son, not once. Hate was too heavy to carry. What he carried instead was understanding. His son's cruelty came from fear of aging, of losing control, of seeing himself in his father's eyes. People who hurt others are often running from their own reflection. He had stopped taking that pain personally long ago. Because once you understand why someone breaks you, you stop blaming yourself for the scars. Sometimes he'd sit by the water's edge, toss a small stone into the waves, and say quietly, "This was me. Once small, once thrown, but still part of something greater." The ripples spread, then disappeared. But he knew they'd reach farther than he could see, just like the quiet lessons of his life. In his final years, he wrote a short letter addressed to no one in particular, a reflection meant for anyone who might find it. It said, "If life teaches you anything, let it be this. You cannot control how people treat you, but you can control how you answer them. The world doesn't remember who shouted the loudest. It remembers who stood the calmest." When he finished, he placed the letter inside his journal, closed it, and set it on his table beside his teacup. The sea roared softly outside, endless and forgiving. He leaned back, breathing in the salt air, his eyes half closed. The world had been cruel to him once, but now it was gentle, and that was enough. Because in the end, he didn't need apology or money or justice. He already had something more powerful: peace that couldn't be taken, pride that couldn't be bought, and a story that would outlive both betrayal and pain. He smiled faintly, whispering the last truth that had carried him through everything. He called the police to remove me. But life removed him from my peace, and that was the real justice. Then he closed his eyes, letting the sound of the sea carry his thoughts far away, back to the beginning, back to the lessons, back to himself. And that's how his story ended, not with bitterness, but with grace, not in revenge, but in quiet victory.